Okay, so transported multicellular organisms. So we're going to look at how all those cell transport processes we talked about, osmosis, diffusion, active transport, mostly just osmosis and diffusion, okay, how those can work on a larger scale. Okay, that is, how do they work when we're talking about an entire organism? Obviously, we're not going to use diffusion, and neither is a plant, to transport water from its roots to its leaves, especially if it's a sequoia, okay, a giant sequoia tree that is 200 feet tall, right? Diffusion is not going to be an effective way to transport materials over that distance, but that doesn't mean it can't play a role, okay? And osmosis is also going to play a role. It's not just about moving solutes across membranes of individual cells. It's about balancing salt concentrations in an organism as a whole. And so as a result, it can be used to create a force that can move water. Okay? We already know it creates a force that moves water across a membrane. Well, it can actually create a force that can move water hundreds of meters if necessary. All right, so we're going to look at how nutrients, water, sugar, and minerals are transported in vascular plants. Okay, vascular plants are plants that have tubes to transport water, okay, and sugar. Examples of vascular plants are basically any plant that you can think of except a moss or like a liverwort or a hornwort or something really small that grows right on the ground and doesn't have any tubes, doesn't really have leaves, okay, that kind of stuff. Okay, those would be non-vascular plants. Most of the plants you'd be familiar with, including even grass, is a vascular plant. Okay, they all have tubes. All right, we'll look at the structure of vascular plants. That's not going to be rocket science, like roots and leaves and stems and stuff like that. Okay, and what forces are involved in transporting water and materials within the plant. Okay, so that'll be the focus of today. We'll get through that pretty quickly, and then we'll get the lab set up. All right, so the general characteristics of a vascular plant. Okay, the first plants to come onto land were not vascular plants. Okay, when we're talking about the evolutionary history of the Earth. The first plants to colonize land were multicellular algae. Okay? They were seaweed that was able to survive periods of drought, essentially. So they would have grown in like the tidal flats where the tide would come in and out. There'd be hours of the day where they would be exposed to the air because the tide would go up. Okay? As plants evolved and mutations happened, natural selection would select plants that could survive that and tolerate it for longer periods. They were able to expand and grow beyond the reach of the ocean. Okay? They could grow onto the sandy soils that are near an ocean, maybe even into the the better soils that would have been available further inland. And of course, once they could get there, they would have all the resources that were available there because there'd be nothing else growing there. Okay? They would also have access to sunlight because there'd be nothing to shade them. There are no other plants, there's no big trees or anything like that. So moving onto land represented a way to get nutrients and resources that a plant would require. The limiting factor, okay, the thing that would limit your ability to go onto land, was your ability to get and transport water when you have no ability to shade yourself anymore. Okay? Remember that the water, if you're growing in the water, water's not a problem. It's everywhere. Okay? You don't have to worry about running out of it. Okay? When you move out of the water, you have to worry about, now I've got so much light, I don't know what to do with it, and it's drying me out. How do I get water? How do I stay wet? Okay? How do I transport that water from one part of the plant to another? And probably the earliest vascular plants would have had part of themselves staying in the water and transporting water, okay, through the primitive vascular system or tubes, okay, from the water where they were originally growing to the parts of their bodies that were outside of the water. Okay? And then it would have evolved from there to include things like roots and stuff like that. Okay, so the resources that a plant needs to survive are spatially separated. That means they are not in the same place. Water and nutrients are in the soil, where there's no light. Okay? Light is in the air, where there's access to carbon dioxide, which they need, but there's no water and nutrients. So they have to have a way to transport things in two directions. Okay? Roots are capable, obviously, of absorbing water and nutrients, but they are not capable of carrying out photosynthesis and producing their own food because they're where? Underground, where it's dark. Okay? Similarly, leaves have to be covered with a waxy cuticle that prevents them from being able to absorb moisture. So they can't absorb any moisture or nutrients, but they're always in the sun, so they can produce lots of sugar using photosynthesis. So there's got to be a two-way system of transport within a plant that allows water and nutrients to come from the roots to the leaves and allows food to go from the leaves to the roots. Okay? Kind of a trade-off. Right? One supplies the other with what they need given what they have. All right, so the body of a vascular plant is differentiated into a subterranean root system, so underground roots, okay, that absorbs water and minerals, and a shoot system, okay, that consists of leaves and a stem that can transport materials and carry out photosynthesis. All right, so some examples, because there's lots of different ways that plants have evolved to do this. Okay, some examples are these. How many people have strawberries growing in their yard? Okay, so I don't know if you guys have ever noticed this about strawberries, but the plants tend to crawl. Okay? And by crawl, I mean they'll put out like a little tendril that kind of just has, it just looks like a stem, but it doesn't really have much in the way of leaves on it, maybe one or two little small ones. It just puts it out. Okay? And it goes a little bit away from the plant, and when it touches the ground a little ways away from the plant, it'll start growing a root system, and another strawberry plant will grow in that position, connected to the old plant through this tube. Okay? And so that tube can actually allow the exchange of nutrients across the two separate plants. Okay? That sort of makes sense? Raspberries will do the same thing. If anybody has a raspberry patch, they can get out of control in a hurry because they do the same thing. Okay? You'll start getting raspberry plants growing up in the middle of your lawn, 6, 7, 8 feet away, okay, from the patch of raspberries. And it's not just because you were sitting out in the middle of the yard eating raspberries and dropping seeds everywhere. Okay? It's because they actually crawl, okay, underground, not above ground. Okay? Some plants have adapted to use their roots to store energy. Okay? The one you see there on in the middle here, okay, this is like cassava, which is in the potato family. It's kind of like a potato, but doesn't really look like one, okay? But it's really starchy, okay, like potatoes are, right? So what the plant does is when conditions are ideal, it makes way more food than it needs. So it stores the excess food in the root system, in this rhizome, okay, that grows down below, all right? When the conditions are not favorable, the plant goes dormant. And then when conditions become favorable again, it has an energy source from which to draw in order to grow back. Okay? This is how potatoes work as well. Right? How many people have ever seeded potatoes before? Okay, nobody else. All right. Here's how you seed potatoes. Take a potato, cut it in half, and put it in the ground. Okay? I mean, you can plant the actual little tiny seeds of a potato plant, and those will grow too. But the quickest way to make a potato plant grow is to take a potato, cut it in half, and put it in the ground. Right? There's enough energy in that potato to start a new plant growing. You may have noticed this happening in your pantry. If you leave a potato in there, you forget about the potato, it turns into a spider. A big one with purple legs. It'll freak you out if you like moving stuff around and a potato got stuck behind a bunch of stuff. Okay? Because you pull it out and it'll look like a giant spider is sitting behind it, okay, with these big purple legs, because it sprouts. Okay? They grow from the little eyes, right? You've ever seen eyes on a potato? Okay? The roots will grow from there. Okay? If you leave it in your pantry, it'll start to get mushy because it's starting to convert the starches into sugars that it can use to help itself grow. Okay? So it starts growing these sprouts that are trying to get to the sunlight. Because if they can get to the sunlight, they can carry out photosynthesis. Usually, though, the potato just becomes rotted before they get there. Okay? Unless you have really left them for a really long time. Got roots somehow. Okay? Hopefully that doesn't happen. Okay? But that will happen if you leave a potato for too long. Okay? So there's just another example of a plant that can carry out photosynthesis and use its roots not only to get energy, but to get water and nutrients, but to also store energy in what we call a tuber. Okay? And that's why potatoes have so many calories in them. Okay? If you're trying to watch your calorie intake, potatoes are the last thing you want to eat. Because they are full of starch, it's full of calories. Okay? They're a very high energy food. okay? Which is why French fries are even worse, because it's a potato, which is got starch in it, which is like plant fat, okay? It's the way plants store energy, thrown into animal fat and fry, okay? So it absorbs all of that. So you've got like the two highest energy molecules there are, fat and starch, and you combine the two, which is why it's so yummy, okay? Just you take those two, yummy things and put them together, okay? All right, and another way that plants can adapt, okay, is they can actually turn their the base of their leaves also into energy storage, and you can see that with things like onions, okay? Beets are kind of like that as well, or they're kind of more like halfway between a tuber and an onion, okay? And they store those as sugars, which is why those things are sweet, while potatoes are bitter. Okay, starches tend to be bitter, okay? Sugars obviously are sweet, okay? So onions tend to be sweeter. All right, making sense? Okay, so the biggest challenge for a vascular plant, for any plant living on land, okay, the biggest challenge is water. Okay? Light's not usually a problem unless you're in the undergrowth of a forest and everything is trying to shade you out. Okay? Most of the time, your limiting factor is going to be water. Okay, so an important adaptation of vascular plants is something called lignin. Okay? Lignin helps make plants tougher. Okay? And I don't mean like tougher like they can endure things. I mean tougher like they don't fall over. Okay? So lignin allows a plant to get taller without tipping over. Height is important. Okay? So is root depth. Lignin can also help roots to get stronger so that they can penetrate deeper into the soil. Okay? So this lignin stuff, which is kind of like cement, okay, takes the cell walls of individual cells and essentially cements them together like if you're laying bricks. Okay? So you guys have probably never laid bricks before. If you look at the back wall, okay, it's made of cinder block, which is bricks. Okay? The way you lay bricks is you take individual bricks and you put mortar or cement in between them. Okay? And you make sure that it gets into the holes that are in the bricks. Okay? Cinder blocks obviously have like the big holes in them. Okay? Smaller kind of red bricks will usually have 3 holes. Okay? Drilled through them or formed into them. Okay? And so if the mortar can get into those holes, then it holds the 2 bricks together. Okay? Cements them together. That's what lignin does to the individual cells of a plant. Okay? When that happens, you go from having a fleshy type of stem, like this does, okay, which is fairly fleshy, to having something that's more wood-like. Okay? Lignin is what makes a plant wood-like or woody. Okay? So a giant sequoia like this, it has lots of lignin. All of its cell walls are cemented together, which is much stronger than if you tried to have just a stringy green thing growing up that tall. The first wind and it would fold. Okay? That sort of makes sense to everybody? So a plant relies on its cell walls and its water vacuoles to stay upright. But by itself, that's not going to allow a plant to get very tall. It's going to need lignin if it's going to get really tall. Okay? Everybody kind of follow me here? All right. Now, I'm going to show you a quick video here that I got completely by accident. Okay. I was doing a time lapse, actually, of the lab we're about to do. Okay. I was just trying to catch the dye going into the leaf over a couple of days. So I set up my GoPro and just put it on time lapse and was hoping that I'd be able to kind of watch it go in there. Didn't work out because the light was too much on it and you couldn't really see it very well. But I want you to watch the plant next to it. Okay? Do you see how limp this plant looks? It's all wilted because I forgot to water it for like 3 months. Okay? It didn't die, but it was pretty sick. Okay? So I watered it the same day I set this next to it because I set this next to it and went, oh crap, I forgot to water my plant forever. Okay? So I watered it. Now I want you to watch what happens to this plant throughout the video. Okay? It's all limp and hanging down. Watch how it looks as this goes along. There, it'll come back. Okay. See the leaves starting to, it's not growing. It's just getting its water vacuoles filled back up again. Okay? So it's becoming healthier. Those water vacuoles filling back up, the turgor pressure is coming back, okay? And you can see, okay, all of the leaves starting to fill back up and become more firm. Some of them were too far gone. You can see some of them aren't doing anything, but okay, the younger, healthier ones, okay, they were able to come back. Yeah, but if we back it up, you can really see that the effect that that turgor pressure has on the shape of the plant. Okay, that's again not the plant growing, that's just the plant's vacuoles filling back up again. Okay, so while that is an important part of keeping a plant upright and firm, it only allows a plant to get so tall. Okay, it's not going to support a lot of foliage, a lot of leaves and things like that. So lignin is important. Lignin can also be used to protect seeds. Okay, lots of plants do this. Okay, anything that makes pine cones or nuts, okay, is using lignin to protect the seeds. Okay, because the seeds are inside. All right. Now, turgor pressure, that's what we just saw, okay, what we were talking about. Okay, so this is, I always forgot to water this plant until the pandemic hit, and then I was gone for many months, and it finally died. So I lost all my plants in the pandemic. I used to have a whole bunch of plants. Then we were gone for like 6 months. I didn't come back to water. Oops, they all died. Anyway, this is what they used to look like. Okay? And I would always forget to water them, and they would get sick and they'd look like this. Okay? And then eventually they would come back. Okay? They don't have that turgor pressure, they're just limp. Okay? But they fill back up with water. Okay? But once they get crunchy, then it's too late. Okay? As long as they're still a little bit green, okay, kind of floppy, you can save them, but once they get crunchy, it's over. And they were all crunchy. Okay? So you can see here again, this is what the cells, the individual cells would look like, okay, when they're completely dehydrated. That dehydration is caused by osmosis. As the plant loses water, okay, water evaporates, the salt stays behind. Any salts, nutrients that were absorbed with the water from the soil are left behind as the water evaporates. When those start to build up in the plant's tissues, water is drawn out of the water vacuoles because of osmosis. Okay? The plant doesn't use the water vacuole to store water. Okay? It's not a camel. It doesn't use it to store water. It uses it to support the cell's shape. And as osmosis starts to draw that water out, that's when you see, okay, that the plant the turgor pressure is not enough to push against the cell wall anymore, and that's when the plant folds over. Okay. Now, parts of the plant. Roots. Roots anchor the plant to the ground and acquire water and nutrients. That's their job. Okay. But roots come in two different types. Okay. They can come as a taproot, like this, or a fibrous root. Okay. Taproots can get pretty big, and they can go pretty deep. Fibrous roots are obviously a lot finer, but they can spread out a lot more. They can also get pretty deep. Okay? Taproots generally can get deeper than fibrous roots, but fibrous roots can also go pretty deep. The advantage of a fibrous root is it can spread out a long way from the plant. Okay? The advantage of a taproot is that it can go deep into soil that's not likely to dry out. Okay? If you're a plant with a fibrous root system and it's just at the surface, well, the root system can be dry pretty quickly. The advantage of having that is that when it does rain, you can absorb all the water really quickly because you don't have to wait for it to absorb all the way down or be right around where your taproot is. So you kind of get a bigger surface area. Okay? That said, there isn't really an advantage, like one isn't better than the other. It's entirely situational. Okay? Some are better adapted to certain situations. Okay? Given what I just said, which type of root do you suppose a saguaro cactus would have? That'd be the ones you'd see in Arizona with the arms. Yeah, that's what most people would say, is a taproot, but it actually doesn't. It actually has a fibrous root system, okay? If you live in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, it doesn't matter how deep your roots go. Unless you can tap an aquifer, okay, which would be like a well with your root, it's dry all the way down. It never rains, well, it rains, but very, very rarely. So, saguaro cactus actually have a fibrous root system. Only goes down a couple inches into the dirt. Okay? But it can spread out 50 meters from the plant. So when it does rain, it can absorb a lot of water right from the surface because it isn't going to have time to absorb. Okay? It's hot and it's dry. Okay? That water hits the ground and it's either getting absorbed by plants or it's evaporating, but it is not percolating down into the soil. It's not going to be absorbed deep into the ground. So you're actually better in that situation to have a set of roots that's really close to the surface. Okay, tap roots, okay, like we said, they can go pretty deep, and they can be used to store food energy. Okay, a carrot and a beet are examples of tap roots. Okay, so they can store a fair amount of energy. Fibrous roots, okay, they can get these little nodules on them. Okay, and these little nodules can help them, can often contain bacteria that can convert nitrogen in the air into nitrates. Okay, which is what's in fertilizer. So it can actually take nitrogen out of the air, turn it into fertilizer for the plant. So plants that have fibrous root systems can actually help to enrich the soil they grow in. Right? And farmers who rotate their crops often will rotate to plants that do this. So one year they'll grow a really nutrient demanding crop like canola, okay, the stuff that got the yellow flowers on it. Okay, they'll grow that. It is really nutrient demanding, like it just strips the soil. Okay, and then the next year they'll grow beans or field peas or something like that because they have roots like this that can put nitrogen back into the soil when they're done. Because when you harvest beans, you leave the roots. Okay? And so all the nitrogen that was brought in from the atmosphere stays in the soil, decomposes, and it's available for the next round of planting. All right, questions on what roots do? All right, so the main purpose of stems is to support the plant, okay, support the foliage that's doing all the photosynthesis, and it's the highway. It's transporting materials up and down. It's transporting sugars down to the roots, okay? It's transporting water up from the roots to the leaves, okay? It's also where you're going to find all your new growth, okay? So on the stem, you will find buds. Okay? And buds are where new tissue can grow from. They're full of stem cells. Okay? Inside of a bud are all those unspecialized parenchyma cells we talked about that can become anything. Leaf, more stem, okay? Whatever the plant needs it to become. Okay? So they'll grow from there. And if a plant gets broken off or eaten, this is what would replace the lost foliage. Okay, so if a cow comes along and chews off the top part of this plant, the plant will grow back from the next set of buds. This is actually, how many people have ever been to like a hedge maze? True hedge maze, or have a hedge? Okay. So the way you make a hedge look full, or any plant look full, is you keep pruning it. Okay? It's counterintuitive. The more you cut it back, the thicker it gets. It doesn't get any taller, but it gets thicker because you're always cutting it off and making it grow from below. So instead of having one big branch, now it's going to have 4 branches, right? And they'll start to look really, really full and leafy. Okay? So the more you trim it, the fuller it'll look. The same is true of your lawn. Okay? The more you cut it, the fuller it gets, as long as you keep watering. If you just cut it and then don't water it, it'll just die. But if you keep cutting it and keep it healthy, it'll get thicker and thicker the more you cut. Okay, everybody good with stems? Okay, so stems support the foliage and they transport water and sugar. All right, leaves. We talked about the layers of the leaf and why they're so important. They're still so very important. Okay, we are worried about your typical C3 leaf. We're not worried about C4 leaves. Okay, C4 leaves are actually not leaves. They're what cacti would have. Okay, they work a lot differently. So we're worried about your typical leaf, okay, that has obviously your upper epidermis that secretes the cuticle. Okay, so this was our example of multicellularity and specialization, but it's also important to know what all these parts of the leaf do from a what does a plant do kind of perspective. Okay, so that top layer secretes that waxy cuticle that seals the leaf and doesn't allow water to escape. Okay, that way the plant can control its rate of evaporation. Okay, down below that is the palisade layer where we have densely packed vertical plant cells. Okay, they are carrying out photosynthesis. That's the job of that layer. Underneath that are very loosely packed, or not even packed, just very loosely aggregated plant cells that make up the spongy layer where water is stored, okay, where carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged through the stomates, which are made up of two guard cells, which we talked about the day we talked about multicellularity as well. Okay, so they open and close, okay, in response to, again, osmosis. So osmosis is a big process here. As the plant carries out photosynthesis and loses water, okay, salts start to build up in the spongy layer. Okay, as those salts build up, they will draw water out of the guard cells, and the guard cells will change their shape because their vacuoles will drain, and that'll close the stomates and prevent any further evaporation. And the plant can then control, okay, how much water it loses that way. All right? And then inside of all of the leaf tissue, you're going to find veins. And the veins contain the two kinds of transport tissue. The phloem, which is the outside, we'll talk about that in a minute, and the xylem, which is the inside. The phloem transports sugar downwards, and the xylem transports water upwards. All right, so leaves, like we said, main photosynthetic organ of the plant. So that's their main job, carry out photosynthesis. Okay, leaves have veins and they transport nutrients to the cells of the leaf. Leaves are arranged in a number of ways. This is the way we're going to be most concerned with. Okay, but the general shape of a leaf is this, and you'll need to add this to yours because it's not on there. Okay, so this is your typical leaf shape. This is the blade. This is the stalk. And right here, where it would attach to the plant, is called the petiole. Okay, but most plants have that sort of layout. Grasses don't have a petiole because they don't have stems, they're just leaves. Okay? And obviously cacti don't have leaves. Well, actually they do. What do their leaves become? Some of them become flowers, but most of them are thorns. The thorns of a cactus are actually its leaves. Okay? They've evolved to no longer carry out photosynthesis, but protect the cactus from being eaten. All right, questions on the leaves? Okay. All right, so transport in plants works like this. Okay? There are these tubes, okay, within the plant, okay? Under an electron microscope, this is what that tube system, that vascular system looks like, okay? So all these little holes, okay, some of the bigger ones and the small ones, are all part of the xylem. The xylem is the set of tubes that carries water from the roots to the leaves. Now, perspective here. This line is 100 micrometers. Okay, so it's about the size of your paramecium, okay, or your euglena, okay? So how big are all those little holes? Pretty small? Like microscopic. We're not talking about a straw, okay? These tubes are incredibly small, and they have to be. The process that the plant uses to transport water would not work if these tubes were any bigger. Okay? Here's how a plant transports water. As water evaporates from the leaf through the stomate, salts get left behind. Those salts cause osmosis to happen. Okay? So water moves out of cells and towards the salts. But water is a polar molecule. Remember that from Unit 1? Okay, it's got a positive end and a negative end. So all this water that's moving towards the salt that's in the leaf is hydrogen bonded to other water molecules down the plant, down the stem of the plant, all the way to the roots. Okay? They're linked by hydrogen bonds. So as one on the top moves towards the salt, it tugs on the ones below it, pulling them up the plant. The plant expends no energy to move water from its roots to its leaves, no matter how tall it is. It just uses the osmotic pressure that's created by water evaporating from the leaves to pull water up the tubes. Okay? Now remember, is water heavy? Like, I mean, compare, if you pick up a gallon of water, like 4 liters, pick up 4 liters of water, is it heavy? Yeah, water is actually pretty heavy stuff, okay? Which is why these tubes have to be so small. That column of water that's in the tube has to be thin enough that it's not too heavy for those hydrogen bonds to support it, okay? If I've got even like a thin straw, okay, worth of water, the weight of that column is more than hydrogen bonding could hold. Okay, it'll just fall back down. These tubes have to be able to support a column of water that could be 100 or more meters tall without letting it fall back down, using only the polar nature of water. Okay, adhesion and cohesion. All right, so the tubes have to be microscopic. Okay, think about it this way. If you've got like a drink and you've got a really, really thin straw or a really, really fat straw, okay, certainly you can get more water through the fat straw, but you have to create more suction on the fat straw to move the water because you've got more weight unsupported in the middle of the straw. Okay? The thinner the straw is, the more the polar nature of water can help support the column of water. Okay. Everybody all right with that idea? Okay, so these are microscopic little tubes. So the process goes like this. Water gets absorbed in the roots. There's an osmotic pressure that is created there that pulls the water into the roots. Okay? Then it moves up the xylem, okay, using this cohesion and adhesion and the polar nature of water, till it gets to the leaves where it evaporates. While it evaporates, photosynthesis is going on. Okay? While photosynthesis goes on, sugars are produced in the leaves. Sugars have to move down the plant, but they can't travel in the same tubes. And you can't have something going up and something going down in the same tube. That's like having northbound and southbound traffic in the same lane. Okay? I can't do that. So there's a separate set of tubes called the phloem that are on the outside of the plant. Okay? You guys have probably noticed this. If you look at a tree, the sap is always on the outside, just under the bark. That's where the phloem is. That sap is the sugar that is being produced by photosynthesis going down the plant toward the roots. Okay. All right, so that'll move down, okay, through the phloem down to the roots. Doesn't need any special transport mechanisms. What will get it there? What force will it use to get the sugar down to the roots? Gravity. It's free and it always points downwards. Okay, so it's convenient in that gravity will pull the sugary sap down to the roots for us. All right, so you've got that there, okay, in your notes. That's describing each of the numbered processes in that diagram. All right, so within the plant, you've got the xylem on the inside, you've got the phloem on the outside. All the xylem is old phloem, okay? As a plant grows, it gets girthier, okay? So it gets wider and wider and wider. And it does that by growing each season a new phloem. Okay? So it's always it's always adding a layer to the outside, always adding a layer to the outside, which is why when you cut a tree down, you see rings. Okay? The rings represent where the phloem was each growing season. They can actually tell us a lot about the plant, okay, and the environment that it grew in. Sometimes you'll get tree rings that are really, really close together, okay, which means those seasons the plant didn't grow very much. Maybe it was really cold, okay, or really dry, or something like that. And if you get really wide rings, those would represent years where the plant did really well and grew a lot. Okay, so that they can tell us a lot about where the plant grows. All right, so xylem's on the inside, transporting water up the plant using osmosis and the polar nature of water. The phloem is on the outside. It transports sugars from the leaves to the roots using gravity. I guarantee you that will be on your test. Okay? I will ask you exactly that. Name the two transport tubes, what they transport and how. So quick review. Xylem. It's on the inside of the stem, transports water up the plant by osmosis and the polar nature of water. We probably need to explain in a little more detail, and you've got that on your diagram already. Okay? Phloem transports sugar from the leaves to the roots using gravity. Okay, so this is what we were talking about. Okay, within the xylem, those tiny microscopic tubes, okay, we've got water that's moving up, and it's doing that by osmosis. Okay, so transport is accomplished by a process involving osmosis, adhesion, cohesion of water molecules. Okay, as water evaporates from the leaves, the remaining solution becomes more concentrated, and that pulls more water up the stem to balance the concentration. Okay. That part that I have underlined is something you will need to know, because I always ask for an explanation as to how a plant can transport water. Okay? That is the explanation. Water evaporates from the leaves, salts get left behind, osmosis moves water towards the salts, which pulls the water up the plant. Okay? And we're using here that polar nature of water. So the water can hydrogen bond to the inside of the xylem tubes, and it can hydrogen bond to itself. Okay? All right. Questions there? Anyone still need that? All right, and then for the phloem, okay, again, the sugars that are synthesized in photosynthesis move down the plant in the phloem. Okay, it's slow because the phloem sap is much thicker than xylem sap. Xylem sap is basically just water. Okay, phloem sap is really thick. Well, it is, after all, what we make maple syrup out of. Okay, maple syrup is just somebody tapping the phloem of a maple tree, okay, and capturing the sap. Okay, and then obviously doing some stuff to it, you know, just like the side of a tree. Okay, it's a process that we're doing. Okay. All right, so we're gonna hold off on the questions here. We'll look at those later. I want to make sure we get our labs set up here.